The issue of ADA compliance came to the forefront in my office last year when there were some businesses in Brea that all got the same letter from the same attorney. What it said was demanding payment of $6,000 because the business was not ADA compliant. And there's a lawsuit threatened unless, of course, they paid this, then it would magically go away. That flies in the face of ADA compliance. ADA compliance is there because we want those who do not have the ability to maneuver through stairs and other things that have limited mobility to be able to have access to all the public venues and businesses. But when you have predatory attorneys that are just looking to make a buck, that's gaming the system. And that's what led to my first compliance workshop, because businesses many times think they are compliant, only to find themselves open to a lawsuit because a toilet might be 2 inches off center or some other things that are easily fixed. And so we're going to learn today some of the things that businesses can do to proactively accommodate those who have limitations, physical limitations, but also to make sure you're not as vulnerable. You can never be totally invulnerable, but to not be as vulnerable to predatory lawsuits. Our speaker this morning is David Peters, an attorney from Lawyers Against Lawsuit Abuse. Mr. Peters is an expert in ADA compliance and has consulted in hundreds of ADA lawsuits.
If your business is open to the public, you are almost certainly required to ensure that it's accessible to people with disabilities. And examples of some of the common things include disabled parking, making sure you have a lowered customer service counter, if you have round doorknobs or faucets, changing those out to lever style, removing or securing loose floor mats, etc. All those things, though commonplace and seemingly insignificant to you and I, because we see them every day, they could cause a problem for someone with a disability. You need to keep in mind that California law provides $4,000 or more in minimum damages plus attorney's fees if someone with disabilities comes to your business that's open to the public and they encounter a condition that should have been changed, and if that condition would be a problem for their disability, that's almost a guaranteed $4,000 plus attorney's fees. I call this section Guaranteed Lawsuits. I'm going to show you a bunch of images, and if you see anything like this at your property, you may be a prime target for one of these lawsuits. Clearly, parking continues to be the most common source of claims in these lawsuits. I would say 95% or more of the lawsuits I see relate to the parking area. There's a couple interesting aspects to that. Number one, it's often the easiest area to fix. In many cases, it requires nothing more than paint and signs. And so, I've had judges look you straight in the eye and say, wait, so for $200 you could have prevented this, and now you want me to help you. Certainly inside buildings, there can be structural considerations, as there can in a parking area, but it can be very easy to fix. Also, it can be an absolute barrier. If someone needs a compliant parking space, for example, if they travel with a ramp van, they need to deploy the ramp to get back out and also to get safely back into their vehicle. If they don't have that diagonally striped no parking area, then someone could come and park next to them. They couldn't get back in the vehicle, and if they needed medicine or whatever, they could effectively be trapped. So parking is pretty important, and people have characterized these as drive-by lawsuits, but basically, if people can't park, then they really can't come in. So something to keep in mind, if you've not changed your parking area to meet the 2008 requirements, then you're probably a prime target for a lawsuit. It really shows. We know people are out driving around on the streets looking for issues, and it's very obvious. So we're going to talk about those requirements. Number one is the requirement for properly filled out, properly posted tow-away or enforcement signage. And what this is, you may have tow-away signs on your property. We're not talking about those, some sort of customers only thing. What this is it provides specific warnings that if you park in a space that's designated for people with disabilities and you don't display the required license plate or placard, then you may be towed. And if you don't have this warning posted, you can have beautiful blue paint and blue signs, and a tow truck driver won't tow, and so from some perspectives, you might as well not have disabled parking. If you don't have these filled out, a truck driver, a tow truck driver may not tow. So everywhere I go, I see these beautiful new signs, but they're not filled out, as we'll talk about in a minute. Another very important requirement is this tiny little blue sign, about $12 on the internet, minimum fine $250. It needs to be at every single disabled parking space you have, period. Another important requirement is, you heard me talk just a minute ago about the access aisle, which is that diagonally striped area, which is usually on the passenger's side of the disabled space. That needs to have contrasting striping so that it could be viewed at night. For example, if you have black pavement and you use dark blue paint, that's not going to be very visible at night. Similarly, if you have gray concrete and you have light blue paint, that may not be visible in certain light levels. So those stripes need to contrast. We see a lot of improper tow-away signs, and we see a lot of these properties getting sued. Another thing to watch for is anything with the word handicapped on it. That term is offensive to a lot of people with disabilities because it derives from a time when people with disabilities sat on the side of the road and they had to hold their cap in their hands to ask for money. There's actually a provision in the California Vehicle Code that says you can't have that on a sign in your parking area if the sign was posted after 1992. I would say don't have it at all, no matter when you posted your sign. We see a lot of lawsuits against properties with that word posted. If people don't see the signs like we've just been talking about, you may be asking for a lawsuit. They may assume there's non-compliance and come in and look further. So it's one of the best investments you can make. Mobility is not the only disability. Some people have visual limitations and rely on a cane for navigation. So you can easily appreciate, looking at this picture of the escalator here, if you even if you had some visual ability, in certain light levels, you might not see that at all. Look what a simple solution it was just to put some planters underneath. There's all kinds of different things you can do. But remember, think about, can you detect it with a cane? And if you can't, you need to do something about that. Also, looking at this phone booth here, as you can see, that's a public resource, but it's up on a curb where someone in a wheelchair couldn't get to it. So there's about 7 different relevant configurations that relate to whether a phone is accessible. Some people are taking them out thinking they're not worth the lawsuit risk, but if you're going to have a public phone, you do need to make sure it meets the standards. A growing concern are, we see more and more with these hybrid cars, some of which are undetectable, that someone with visual impairments might not know that they're entering a path of vehicular travel. So sometimes putting barricades up to separate people from vehicles makes a lot of sense, but sometimes that can't be done. So you'll hear people talk about truncated domes or detectable warning tiles, DWTs. That's what these little yellow things are with the bumps. And it may be very important if the general public is right alongside vehicles, it may be very important to have some sort of barrier or some sort of warning so that they don't inadvertently stray into the path. Keep in mind as you're putting in ramps or evaluating your ramps, beyond a certain point, you certainly need to have a landing at the top and the bottom. You may need one in the middle. There may be other concerns to consider, but this all is part of getting people into your business. We talked about clearance in the path of travel. If you go to the ADA sites, you'll hear about a 36-inch standard. Really, in California, it's going to be 48 for most purposes. And watch for tables, chairs, and temporary obstructions. For steps and railings, it's very important to have the extensions on the railings that extend 12 inches beyond the top and bottom, beyond where the slope starts and stops. This is so someone can support themselves, get their balance before they go forward. Improper door hardware, the general rule is that nothing any member of the public has to touch at your property should require them to use pinching, twisting, or grasping. It should be something that could be operated with a closed fist or even a stump. So clearly a round door handle won't work, or a door handle with a squeeze lock won't work. A simple lever style handle is often under $20 and will usually be adequate. And there are other models as well. Some companies that make these coin-operated restroom locks represent that they're ADA compliant. I don't know about that. I know they turn up in lawsuits I see all the time. By the same token, giving someone a key to the restroom is also a problem because it requires pinching, twisting, or grasping. A simple solution is to use one of these push-button code locks. You know, if you need to lock your door and you're worried about the wrong people going in, you can change the code weekly, but something like that won't be a problem for people. I'll skip this slide. We suggest that there are 16-inch kick plates on the push side of all doors. If you look at the codes, you'll generally see 10 inches, but if you look in the notes of the ADAG, it does refer to a 16-inch standard, and we generally suggest using the larger ones. If you can't find anything better than an 8-inch, you could put two 8-inch kick plates, one on top of the other. Door width is pretty critical. If you don't have at least 32 inches net clearance, you've got a problem, but there may be things you can do. Sometimes putting the door on offset hinges can help. Sometimes changing the handle. As you see in this picture on the left here, handles like that, sometimes they're common on doors, and you see these doors everywhere. And sometimes when you see them, you're going to have 31.5 inches of clearance. If you switch that out with a handle like the one you see just to the right of that, you can often resolve the situation without having to change out your door. And all the way to the right, you see one of those retrofit doors I was telling you about that you can put in so that you'll have one door that's more than wide enough with some side light windows on the side rather than having two doors that are too narrow. You do need to have what's called strike clearance on either side of your door. And it's important to keep in mind that typically a wheelchair will not go straight through a door. Often it goes through at an angle. And sometimes some people don't have the manual dexterity to make it straight through. So you can't have bookshelves, or as you see here, say a video game or a cabinet or whatever it is, right next to the door, because even if you do have appropriate door clearance, that could keep someone with a wheelchair out. You really would like to have about 2 feet on either side of a door. In some cases you may be able to do with less, but you know, as you see those planters in that picture had to go. Floor mats we talked about, they tend to foul in wheelchairs' wheels, and basically they need to be secured, embedded, or removed. And embedded grates like the one you see in this diagram are the best for a lot of reasons. Removing them could expose you to a risk of a slip and fall. Inside the business, it's important that you have appropriate aisle width. You may be required to have aisles up to 60 inches wide depending upon the configuration of your business, but at the very least, if you have less than 36 inches net clearance in any aisle, any portion of any aisle, you potentially have a problem. So at the very least, you'd want to have a manager go through with a yardstick out in front of them, go through every area of the building every morning and periodically throughout the day, because you'll find customers rearrange things, and we've seen lawsuits happen very quickly in situations like that. This is a perfect example, and it's significant. I know people look at this and say, you know, they could just go around. But the fact of the matter is that in an emergency situation, things like this can bunch up together and somebody can't get through. Counters are another thing that you want to take a look at the new 2010 standards. As a general rule, we think at the very least, you need to have a 36-inch wide counter, 24 inches deep. It needs to be less. In fact, I've got the measurements are here. And this is an example, by the way, of just how inexpensively you can solve this problem. I had one client basically with a piano hinge, a couple pieces of wood, less than $100 in materials, problem solved. But I want to go back to this slide to show you some of the problems. Number one, it's a dignity issue. If you look at this center photograph, you can just see someone peeking above the counter. If change is being handed back to someone, if you can't face a teller, they feel like a little kid. That doesn't need to happen. In other cases, you see these flip-up counters. It's important to keep in mind, you can do that, but you may be putting your financial resources at issue if a lawsuit is filed. If you do that, you're basically taking the position that you can't afford to put in a proper counter. And if you do that, someone's going to say, then let me see your books since 1992. We think most people are going to say for a few $100 or whatever something like this would cost, do it right. The difference between this and that is that this one is always in position. It flips up so staff can walk back and through, and that actually creates a nice little barricade so that this was in a pharmacy. This prevents customers from going into the wrong area. The counters that are normally down and are flipped up, that's for occasional use, and again, that suggests that you can't afford to, or you're not willing to pay to put in a proper counter. An emerging source of claims are these designations that the register is to remain open during all business hours to assist people with disabilities. At the very least, you certainly want a policy that if you have multiple registers and you have one that is configured for people with disabilities, obviously that needs to be the one that's open at all times, opens the earliest, closes the latest, etc. Whether you need a sign dangling over it with, at 80 inches above the floor, I would tend to do it. We've advised our clients to take 3 of those signs. You can get them at stop signs and more. 3 of them, tape them together, and suspend it so that the base is 80 inches over the floor. You are potentially precluding a claim. There is some debate about whether it's required, and in some cases it is, but in any event, I would do it if I owned a retail store with multiple check stands. Think about reach ranges. As a general rule in the ADA, there's really no limit to how high you can stack things. But if something's outside of the reach range of someone in a wheelchair, at the very least, you might consider posting an assistance sign like the one you see here. On the other hand, if you are able to reposition your items so that everything can be reached by someone in a wheelchair, you're well advised to do so. Table seating continues to be a source of claims. Keep in mind that you and I can belly up to a table, but because of the foot pedals and the knee clearance that's needed, pedestal tables are often a problem. And as you can see, excuse me, in this center photograph here, someone with a wheelchair really couldn't use that table. Same with the one at the bottom. A simple card table that you can even get from a Salvation Army. One of the larger size card tables will often be enough to resolve this. And another factor, we're seeing a growing number of claims by groups in wheelchairs who travel together who would like to eat together at the same table. So I've seen some businesses say with booths, and they'll say, yeah, well, you could fit a wheelchair out on the end. What if you had 4 people in wheelchairs that wanted to eat together at the same table at the same time? It's really nice as you're planning to think about having arrangements for them. Self-service devices, again, this is something new under the 2010 standards. Formerly, you could have some buttons as high as 54 inches from the floor. So when most of you go back to your businesses, you will probably see a number of vending machines with buttons and operative parts as high as 54 inches from the floor. Under the 2010 standards, which again are not mandatory yet, but you should start thinking about replacing anything with a user-operated part over 48 inches from the floor. We're pretty sure you're going to see lawsuits on those very soon. Restrooms. There's about 100 different measurements that apply to a restroom, but it is part of equal access, that if you let your able-bodied customers use the restroom, it needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. The details are in your notes. It's important to keep in mind that every accessible restroom needs at least 2 signs, one on the door and one on the wall. The one on the wall needs to have Braille on it, like we talked about, center line 60 inches above the floor. The one on the door, depending, either needs to be a circle or a triangle, or both, and it depends on whether it's for men or women. You know, if it's wheelchair accessible, it needs to have the wheelchair pictogram on it. And we've shown you the 6 different choices for the wall signs because some restrooms are unisex, some aren't. So don't just grab a sign because it looks right. You need to be sure it's the right one for your restroom. In the old days, before this new law that I told you about, we would show this picture and we would say, how much is this room worth? And in those days, it was $4,000 per item was the damage calculation. So in those days, it would be $4,000 for the paper towel dispenser because it's more than 40 inches above the floor, $4,000 for the mirror because the lowest reflective surface is more than 40 inches from the floor, $4,000 for the soap dispenser, $4,000 for the additional paper towel dispenser, $4,000 because it's a pedestal sink, and another $4,000 because the water supply lines aren't wrapped. So I think that all added up to $48,000. A lot of people forget about the benefits of this new law. We were seeing $4 million claims against businesses that had maybe 1,000 square feet open to the public. Well, this new law stopped that. So you can thank your legislators for quickly recognizing that that needed to change. But the fact, and so now, this room might be worth $4,000 altogether. But just by repositioning things and maybe changing out some hardware, you could avoid the claim entirely. We talked earlier about how a wheelchair typically takes 60 inches to do a complete turn. Some restrooms don't have that space. Sometimes you actually need to move a wall, and maybe you need to think about that. But others have these metal partitions, and in some cases, rather than moving a wall, you could remove the partitions, put a lock on the main door, maybe take out one of the toilets, and make it a single-use facility. Especially in this economy, people are looking for quick ways to provide a good level of accessibility without major undertakings. So that's an option. We suggest you avoid movable objects like the trash can here in the picture at the left. One of the reasons is that people move them around, the cleaning crew, customers, etc. And we often see pictures that the waste can, this germy waste can, was right next to the toilet, and I shouldn't have to, if you're in a wheelchair, you would have to almost pick up a waste can to move it in some cases. And nobody wants to do that. The simple solution is these wall-mounted waste receptacles. If you mount them at the right height so that the paper towel dispenser is 40 inches above the floor, it's going to stay put and you don't have to deal with issues like that. CASP inspections and Senate Bill 1608 from 2008. And remember, CASP stands for Certified Access Specialist, of which we have several in the room. The name of the bill, we call it CRASCA, is the Construction-Related Accessibility Standards Compliance Act. It was passed with strong bipartisan support after a series of failed reforms. There appeared to be widespread acknowledgement of the problem of litigation abuse. And the biggest thing, from my perspective, I was one of the people who worked on this, the biggest thing is that it ended the dollar per item damage calculation so that you can no longer have someone say, I came to your property and you owe me $4 million. This limits recovery to claims which would actually deny access or reasonably dissuade someone with disabilities. It also reconfirms the obligation of the plaintiff to mitigate their damages. Most importantly, it finally provides a way to get some straight answers about what you need to do at your property. Prior to this, we would get 10 experts in a room and maybe get 10 different answers. A lot of people were self-taught. Some people seem to be making it up as they went along. And so now we have a state licensed approach. You can literally go straight to the state's link, and there are hundreds of these CASP inspectors in almost every part of the state. There are some who are also contractors, some who are also architects or engineers. So find the one you need. You may not want to pay for more expertise than you need, but they're an incredible resource. We see a lot of CASP inspections in the $500 range for small businesses. Some businesses are larger or have more complex issues, but it's way cheaper than a lawsuit. It's some of the best money you can spend. If you have been inspected by a CASP before you're served with a summons and a complaint in a lawsuit, you may be entitled to an automatic stay of litigation and an upfront meeting with the judge. The plaintiff is required to attend this upfront meeting. Hundreds of false claims have been documented in these cases, and unfortunately there have been some people who have used many inappropriate tactics. If you think that's happening in your case, the litigation stay and this early evaluation conference can be extremely helpful. If you handle it properly, you can bring it to the judge's attention, and some judges are very concerned about misuse of the law. So if you think, even if you don't think that's happening, it could be very helpful to you, but a lot of people mention that, and it can be a very powerful tool. We've had some matters completely disappear to avoid appearing at the early evaluation conference. To get it, basically all you need is to have your property inspected before you're served with a lawsuit. Some of you learn that there's a lawsuit out there with your name on it or a friend's name on it or whatever, but you haven't been served yet. That could be a golden opportunity. Maybe you're not served properly. Maybe not all defendants in your lawsuit have been served. There could be any number of problems. So the minute you get wind that there could be a lawsuit out there with your name on it, I would be on the phone to a CASP and a lawyer right away so you can make appropriate arrangements.